So, hello everyone. Thank you for remaining and for being here. I will sit, okay, if you don't mind. I will just, I had been challenged to do a small introduction and to host these 2-day sessions of seminar in Nuart Plus. My name is Pedro. I'm from Lisbon, from Portugal. Well, the reason why I'm being invited, I think it's because also I developed a conference in Lisbon for since 2014. It's mostly academic conference, but I came from the practice background, and I give lots of importance to the relation between practice and talking and theory. So hopefully I will try to support this same logic here. Lots of the talkers during the 2 sessions will be, during the 2 days will be also practitioners, as you have seen in the previous presentation. That's very relevant, positive thing of Nuart Plus. Well, I've tried to organize myself with the program designed by Martin and James, and mostly of the information you have it in the books that were on the chairs, and they are available also online on the website of Nuart. Actually, we have 2 days regarding this seminar. Just to give you a bigger picture of the organization of Nuart, you have the interventions in the city, and then you have Nuart Plus. The Nuart Plus, it's a symposium where lots of stuff happened. There's a complex programmation of things that are going on. And the things the parts that I will be hosting, it's the seminar part. So it's this part that will start now and will go today up to, let me check the time, 16 hours. So with breaks and everything. So and after this seminar, the Nuart Plus continues with other activities. Specifically a movie in the Keynote. So just to give you a bit of the context, I will try to make the environment as fluid as possible. I think we are really honored to can be here and to develop these kind of conversations and thoughts. So I think we need to be embedded on this privilege that we have. We need to embrace it. So I think the best way to do it is not being too formal and to interact as human as possible. And I think that, well, the research and the academic structure, it's something that's catching up on what's going on the street. So actually, the theory, it's going after what's being done. And specifically in this topic, and I think we need to have this in consideration also. So we need to be less academic and more practice, but also the practice needs sometimes the theory and the academic part, so it can be sustained and can be reflected and can be somehow valued as other subjects of our culture. It's a kind of a lingo, you know, like the academic lingo for validation of stuff within our society. So that's a bit the role I'm developing in from Lisbon, and I'm trying to sustain this academic journal, the first one that has street art in the name of it. It's quite well sustained academically speaking, with all the structure that's needed. It has near 20 some PhD professors from 14 nationalities that do the review of an open call that goes out every year to publish articles that come out in a magazine, in a journal that's open source. So it's available online, and it's sharing knowledge again throughout the community. It can be also printed. It has costs for printing, but it can be also printed. I have 2 examples here. If someone then want to see, I can show it. This task, it's not well, I felt as a necessity for the field, for somehow saying to the people that make decisions that there are certain characteristics of this phenomenon that can be analyzed scientifically. It can be processed within their decision frame as something else. So I think it's a useful job to think about the subject, to talk about the subject, and to share ideas. And we are trying to do that here. So I think it's a very valuable moment, and we need to be aware of that. Moving a little bit forward and going closer to the first keynote presenter, Mikkel, I have, in the preparatives of this opening, I was looking at the informations of all the speakers. And the first thing I've saw is that the 2 days are divided in revolution and evolution. The first day, revolution, today, you can see, it's a strong word. And I think it was already touched in the Fight Club yesterday evening. It was a pity for me not being present. How many of you were in the Fight Club? Can you raise your arms? Oh, I'm so off this. So I'm talking to you about something that you have seen. And okay, maybe I can change with someone, I don't know. Well, I think it was touched, the subject of revolution as a word and as something that has different meanings, And today morning I was talking with Evan, and I think could be these 2 big frames of revolution. There's the revolution of the everyday person that doesn't think about the meaning of the word and use it as something light and something like to revolve it to mix something and to change something that's in a state and it's going to change. And there's then the frame of thinking that the revolution of the word that has some meaning historically speaking, and it's been used by different occasions in different contexts and stuff. I'm not one of these guys. I'm the guy that used the word for mixing stuff, and or I use the word in a more light way. But in any way, I think these 2 ideas will be around today, even if they are bringing up by Mikkel or by artists or by other speakers. So and getting back to the text that's been written, it's here that unsanctioned art has often been used to give voice to the voiceless. What parallels are there between these historical acts of resistance and the wider street art movement? What does this tell us about the power of art? Power of art to change the world, right? So myself also, and I want to put it also in a light mode. The art word, it's a complex thing, and it's a bit like politics. You know, it can be everywhere, every time, any moment, and there are two levels. There are this level of the guy that designates himself as an artist and the guy that designates himself as a politician, and they do out of it a profession. But everyone is a bit of an artist and everyone is a bit of a politician, because every action that we make and every thought, it has these two components. Getting this small text from here and getting back to Mikkel, I've looked to the website and advise you to see the interview Mikkel did to Rancière. I really recommend the video. It's really interesting, and it's light and it's accessible. And seeing it helped me solve this challenge of hosting. There was some questions that were talked on this interview about staticization of power that I think will be really relevant to this talk and to the wider concept of this year Nuart Festival that has power in question. And one thing I was really interested in the interview was that what was talked about cultural artifacts was the everyday creativity and not the detachment of a common life that some kinds of art allow. So I think there are really a broad spectrum of ideas here. I don't want to be too confusing and bring too much ideas now. I will let that for all the speakers. Hopefully, I will be a good clock guy and tell everyone to be on time and stuff. I will also invite you a lot to interact. So if you want to make some question and everything, just go for it. It depends on the speaker, of course. But anyway, I think it could be really open. We are not so many, so I think it will be really interesting and useful to do that. Well, I don't know. I'm not with the clock now, but I think the 15 minutes should have gone. Yeah, it's good. 15 minutes went. Yeah. So I can go to Mikkel presentation. Mikkel Bolt, yeah, it's coming, please. Mikkel, well, I will not, again, I advise to see the website and to read the information that are available on this book. But I will read just one sentence here. Mikkel will do a presentation, well, is a Marxist art historian, yeah, and political theorist, lecturer in University of Copenhagen. The title of his presentation will be Promises Not Kept, Art, the Art Institution and Social Change. In this presentation, Mikkel will attempt to account for the paradox of art creation as space for discussion, a space for nourishing ideas, and art as a mere product. And you will ask how we can potentially rework or end it in an era characterized by crisis and revival of authoritarian nationalism. So without further ado, Mikkel, hope we have time to know each other after the 6, and good presentation. Thank you.
Thank you. Can you hear me? Or should I? microphone a little closer. Yeah, thanks a lot for the introduction, Pedro, and for like giving some kind of context, for creating a context for the seminar part. Yep.
Or just
no, I can. I'll end up falling behind the scenes, I think. No, thanks a lot for the introduction and the attempt to create a context for the seminar part of Nuart. Yeah, I have a presentation, a talk in two parts that will somehow attempt to come up with a critical reading of the political role of contemporary art. So a huge topic, and of course, as we saw just before, the concept or the framework of the seminar part, the first part of the seminar, is the notion of revolution. So the stakes are high, one could say. And of course, as you started out by saying, I mean, what does revolution mean, and what does revolution mean in what context? I mean, my initial approach would, of course, be to, somewhat in parallel to what you were talking about, Pedro, would of course be to account for the emptying out of the concept of revolution. I mean, in a certain sense, revolution doesn't mean anything at all, at least not in a Norwegian or Danish or Western European context. I mean, once upon a time, until the late 60s, revolution was perhaps the most important political concept. But that's definitely not the case today. So the attempt to try to put into use the notion of revolution presents us with some problems, confronts us with a difficult task, because first of all we have to in a certain sense unpack the word revolution, equip it with a kind of meaning, because the historical process is, of course, in a way that yeah, as I said, the word revolution doesn't mean anything. If it means anything today, I mean, it would be kind of like connected to the idea of a microelectronic or technological revolution, our computers, laptops, etc. That would be one way of using the word revolution. Another one would, of course, be to talk about the kind of like the everyday revolution going on, because what, in a certain sense, has happened since the late 60s or early 70s is that the word revolution once was supposed to be a representation or an expression of a total political, economic, but also mental transformation. But what revolution means today is probably more has to do with kind of like the individual trying somehow to live up to the demands of the market. So what has taken place is, in a certain sense, an individualization of the concept of revolution. So if you want to kind of like use the notion revolution, we have to start with kind of like performing a kind of ideology critique of the very word. So that's one difficulty in a certain sense. But nonetheless, of course, I'm all in favor of trying to reintroduce a notion of revolution. But it's a difficult task, and we have to be fairly precise when we employ or put the notion to use. That was just as a kind of preamble because of this framing concept, and just picking up the thread from Pedro. I'll be talking about contemporary art, somehow trying to account for the political promise or potential of contemporary art. And have chosen the title, Promises Not Kept. I'll talk about contemporary art and the ability of art to articulate critique. I will, of course, not be able to give any kind of systematic exposition. The talk is way too short, and I'll be trying to connect a lot of dots, coming up with what is hopefully a critical reading of the present status of art. And not just a reading of the present status of art, but of course also trying somehow to connect it to this question of revolution, and on the way also coming up with what is supposed to be a really brief analysis of the present historical situation. The presentation is necessarily fragmented, situated in accordance with the conditions of possibility of knowledge production today, where instrumentalization is a priori, and the university so pervaded by economic categories that even defense of Enlightenment ideals of Bildung appears to be a radical stance. A brief word on my position of utterance. We live in turbulent times where academic research is forced from the shelter of its already ruined ivory tower. The patient academic sanctioned analysis must necessarily be expanded or even replaced by a more explicitly political discourse. Descriptive utterances abandoned in favor of performative statements, in which the distinction between academic and political analysis tends to dissolve. In the present situation, there's no other way. Analyses that do not address the accelerated chaos in which we are living are of no use. Everything is breaking down. A prolonged economic crisis, the return of fascism, geopolitical instability, and biospheric meltdown are interwoven processes that put pressure on the analysis and annul any pretense of scientific certainty. So, crisis and breakdown, disruption and meltdown. If history ended in 1989, it has surely been accelerating since 9/11, the terror attack on World Trade Center and Pentagon, and the following so-called war on terror. History has surely been accelerating since 2007 and 2008, with the financial crisis, after the establishment of a global protest movement in 2011, and again after 2016 and the election of Donald Trump in the US. What we've witnessed is how globalization became a state of emergency. The Furies are hounding all and sundry. There's no equilibrium, and it's impossible to predict what will happen. The certainties of yesterday have shown themselves to be built on air and paper money. The economies of the BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, that were supposed to come to the rescue of the world economy after the collapse of 2007-8, were quickly shown to be founded on credit bubbles themselves. the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank are nervously following the development. Gigantic growth in China, which was a central part of neoliberal globalization, where Chinese workers produced cheap commodities for the indebted workers of the West, whose debt was in the last instance guaranteed by the Chinese state banks buying up of US state bonds. This Chinese growth has not only dropped off significantly, but has also been shown to be supported on risky loans itself. So we're in a mess. In the US, it has become difficult for the ruling class to keep a lid on the situation. The financial crisis revealed enormous national inequality, resulting from the 40-year-long hollowing out of middle-class household economies, making it difficult for the two political parties to control the political public sphere. Trump is the best expression of this development, of course. But phenomena like Bernie Sanders, the Tea Party movement, Occupy, and Black Lives Matter are all challenges to the systems. Same old, same old. Of course, it's not much better in Europe, where the combination of tough austerity programs and fleeing revolutionaries from Syria and the Middle East and migrants from Africa have thrown the EU into crisis. In several countries, near-empty coffers are scraped even barer, and racist solutions are being tested and integrated into state policy across the board. The UK is leaving the EU. Spain is in a state of apparently perpetual political chaos. In Germany, Merkel is challenged by a resurgent right-wing nationalism. And in France, the old parties have broken down, and large parts of the youth have simply deserted national democracy. Everywhere, political, economic, and climatic chaos are fusing into an opaque web where it's difficult to see what's up and what's down, and where it's easier to see what's falling apart than what's emerging. So I'm painting a picture of a severe crisis. A crisis in which certainties of yesterday are breaking down, and where it's extremely difficult for the ruling ideology of the last 30, 40 years, which we in a shorthand could term neoliberalism, where it's extremely difficult for neoliberalism to reproduce itself ideologically. Thus, the resurgence of different kinds of neo-nationalism and fascism. This crisis, the crisis is seriously questioning previous practices, beliefs, and commitments. I mean, and this is of course also the situation in which the concept or word or practice of revolution might once again become relevant. The crisis is seriously questioning previous practices, beliefs, and commitments. The relative autonomy that art and academia have been equipped with for the last 200 years is under tremendous pressure from both within and without. I mean, that's the story about art as a modern phenomenon, is of course that art is identifiable as art because it's relatively autonomous. But this relative autonomy of art and the university or academia is breaking down. From the inside, the promise of happiness is forcing art into avant-gardist transgressions or revolutionary engagements in the ongoing struggles against power and capital. From the outside, the culture industry is threatening to realize art upside down as an expanded participatory experience economy. When it comes to academia, the commodification of education, research, and knowledge appears almost complete. I've made a slide presentation, but it's just mainly background images, so you can just go back and forth somewhat. So what I'm trying to argue is, of course, that what we're used to as art, the art institution, but of course also kind of like academic scientific research, are of course also due to the crisis somehow struggling to reproduce themselves. So I'm trying to paint this picture of a crisis in art, but of course trying to connect it to a much broader social process. So you could also say that late capitalism is in a state of permanent crisis, and that contemporary art somehow expresses this crisis. Saying that, of course, risks inscribing a treachery, a development of decline into the analysis. But the crisis is constitutive, so to say. The crisis was, in a way, already there in the interwar avant-garde movements. It was already there in Walter Benjamin, Adorno, De Boer, and all the others. This has to do, of course, with capitalism and its revolutionary mode of production that renews itself insistently, expands, liquidating on the way not only institutions and apparatuses, but also forms of solidarity and senses of community, creating new ones that are then dissolved and replaced by new ones again. All that is solid melts into air and all that. From Marx to De Boer to Robert Kurz, capitalism is a Moloch that colonizes more and more aspects of human life, recreating the world in its own picture. Almost everything is mediated by the commodity form, and all social relations are put in the real metaphysical service of an impersonal economy. This vertiginous movement is in a sense one long crisis. One long crisis that modern art registers and interprets. And therefore the crisis is the material all the way from Baudelaire and Mallarmé to Benjamin and De Boer and onwards. Capitalism is not just modernization and development. It's also crisis and underdevelopment, the combined and uneven development Trotsky described, where general underdevelopment is hidden behind conjunctural upturns in consumption for a select group. I mean, that's of course important. When in Norway, in Stavanger, in Northern Europe, in an intense conjunctural upturn, which is of course connected to extreme underdevelopment, many other places. The development in the West after World War II, up to the 1970s, was just such an upturn. While we in the West experienced a tremendous economic and socio-cultural recovery, the rest of the world was to a large extent mirrored in underdevelopment. Even the enormous growth in China since the mid-1980s is in reality the pauperization of a far larger number of peasants and workers who have been wrested free from pre-capitalist means of existence. Dissolution into capital, as Marx termed it. So what I'm trying to argue, or at least contemplating, is of course that I mean we are confronted with a really serious crisis, but of course we somehow have to embed the analysis of this crisis in a much longer historical analysis, where it becomes visible that in a certain sense capitalism is a permanent crisis that takes the form of what I term conjunctural upturns for specific groups, but primarily underdevelopment for many more people. And modern art has, in a certain sense, always been different kinds of attempts to thematize or rework or challenge that process, the process of combined and uneven development. In Bad New Days, his latest book, American art historian, art critic Hal Foster writes that contemporary art is so vast and diverse and so present that it can be difficult to give an overview of contemporary art. Of course, he's right. Contemporary art is a highly composite and heterogeneous object, one that institutionally includes everything from politicized, artist-run exhibition spaces to large commercial galleries or art fairs. In Copenhagen, for instance, contemporary art encompasses such different institutions as the privately owned 1,500 square meters exhibition space Favrskov Foundation on the harbor front in Nordhavn, where international bestsellers like Louise Bourgeois or Ai Weiwei show massive installations. But contemporary art also includes camp and exhibition space in a shelter for asylum seekers in Outer Nørrebro. In between, we have small and large museums, all of which are confronted with the need to attract tourists and function as places for some kind of cultural education. Then there's the commercial galleries that not only have to earn money, but also sometimes present artists who have some kind of real or imagined political engagement. And of course, then there's all the artist-run spaces that often have a more experimental or process-based character. There's the School of Fine Art with all its students and teachers. Then we have the university where contemporary arts get discussed and analyzed. Then there's the media, newspapers, etc. This local scene is of course connected in many different ways, both institutionally and personally, to a long list of other art milieus in the so-called global art institution. Altogether, this is a very layered and composite scene that carries out a range of often contradictory functions under pressure from outside forces and developments. With Pierre Bourdieu, the French sociologist, we can call this a field, a social microcosmos where the development of artistic production is driven by conflicts between actors that fight for field-specific recognition. The internal fight for recognition that historically is this internal fight for recognition is historically the inversion of the dominant economic logic, which is always put under pressure by the very same external economic logic. This is also a description of the relative autonomy of art, of course. Art is characterized by autonomy. Art is art, nothing. Art is not supposed to abide external defined rules. But art is, of course, could also be described as heteronomy, as Bourdieu says. There's an external pressure. And the external pressure has only augmented. If there's a development that has been significant during the last 25 years in contemporary art, it is without a doubt that the production, circulation, and reception of contemporary art have become more and more fully integrated into a global culture industry. After the fall of the Berlin Wall, and especially since the late 1990s, the art market has not only tended to acquire a hegemonic status in contemporary art, but contemporary art has also become part of an expanded experience economy, where art is fused with cultural tourism, pop culture, and gentrification. The explosion in the number of biennials and the erection of one more spectacular museum after another is the most visible expression of this development. This is what Hal Foster calls the Bilbao effect, where cities and museums compete in attracting visitors and sponsors through spectacular buildings and large art events. It's important, of course, not to become totally hypnotized by the sudden inflow of paper money in art. It's important to analyze this development as an expression of a decisive new development that finally pulls the rug under contemporary art's supposedly transgressive potential. That would be one reading. One conclusion would, of course, be that that art has once and for all sold out or become nothing more than a luxury good for the 1%. But as we know from the avant-garde and modernist Marxists like Adorno, Herbert Marcuse and Guy Debord, this is part of a much longer development in which a shift occurs in the relationship between art and economy over the course of the 20th century. Different concepts like culture, industry, and spectacle are attempts to come to terms with this development, where modern art somehow becomes a part of the base superstructure model, becomes a part of the base. Art is integrated into capitalist economy. And that would be a large part of the analysis of people like Adorno, Marcuse, and Debord. And they're somehow trying to account for the expanded domain of cultural production. That mass cultural production and consumption somehow becomes economic, becomes as economic as the productive spheres in society. This is important because it shows us that it's not a new development that we're confronted with. These contradictions are somehow part of the foundation of art. If we zoom in and look at the art institution from the inside, from within the framework of its relative autonomy, we can, on the one hand, observe the art institution as a space for political discussion and militant actions that rarely takes place elsewhere. Just here in Stavanger, it's funny that there's an election going on in Norway, characterized by extremely outrageous and stupid comments by politicians trying to compete, being more and more racist and nationalist. But at the same time, there's discussions taking place in institutions like this one, staged under the topic of revolution. So that's, of course, that would be kind of like the positive analysis or reading of the function of contemporary art. This first day has to do with revolution, and in 3 weeks there's a big literary festival in Stavanger, which also has to do with revolution. The theme is revolution. This Kapitel literary festival. So there's a lot of discussions not taking place elsewhere that are somehow taking place within the institution of art. And this is, of course, also why artists and cultural producers, for instance, played a leading role in Occupy Wall Street in New York in September 2011. So this is like the positive, the optimistic analysis of the function of contemporary art. In the disappearance of a genuine political left-wing public sphere, art actually functions as a kind of substitute for discussions not taking place elsewhere. On the other hand, one could argue, of course, that contemporary art is the window dressing and sale of only apparently critical utterances or forms that in no way challenge the ruling taste. On the contrary, contemporary art has become indistinguishable from all other forms of aesthetic entertainment. Contemporary art is no longer just a research and development unit of advanced capitalism. Instead, art is part and parcel of an all-encompassing experience economy on a level with advertising, fashion, music, TV, and games. So the contradictions are obvious. On the one hand, we have exhibitions and practices that are political, almost revolutionary, at least on a rhetorical level. On the other hand, we have the merging of contemporary art with an expanded experience economy. The narrative of, or the analysis of contemporary art must of course focus on this last aspect, on the extreme marketization and instrumentalization that has taken place during the last couple of decades. But it must also necessarily be about how contemporary art has been the place where political conflicts have been made visible and discussed in a manner that has seldom been the case elsewhere. Art functioning as the remnants of a former left public sphere that have been destroyed. This is the story of contemporary art as a space for political engagement and critique of the system. Even though the relative autonomy of art is under pressure and is changing, the artistic field and the individual artwork are still characterized by being partly outside the capitalist logic of production and administration. And of course, it's this partial separation, this relative autonomy, that somehow still equips art with some kind of transgressive potential. This is one of the explanations why we have seen art, and in other words, institutions of art, be a place of different kinds of institutional critique, political curating, and ambiguous escape attempts, where artists and cultural producers attempt to redirect the potential of art and connect it to extra artistic formations and movements. This does, however, remain an exception, as most practitioners prefer to exhibit political representation inside the framework of the institution of art. Not many leave behind its comfortable habitus, but it does happen. The auto-globalization movement and Occupy are events where art is embedded in broader political movements, and the professional gesture of art is somehow expanded and becomes creative dissensus outside. So this is the positive stress on art, that somehow there's something subversive about art. Somehow it has to do with rebellion or revolt. As Debord would phrase it, art is revolutionary or it is not. That would be his way of accounting for the problem. But of course, as we all know, all the revolutionary experiments of art and the revolutionary working class assault on capitalism have failed. The 19th and 20th century has been one long, discontinuous panoply of collapses and breakdowns, where revolutionary theory has either been brutally crushed or been turned into a nightmare, reproducing the oppression it was meant to fight. In the last decades of the 20th century, the dream of another world appeared almost lost to eternity. The end of history was realized as Washington Consensus and neoliberal globalization. I mean, that would be kind of like the analysis of what happened with revolution, that it disappeared. Today, everything is measured in money. In most Western European countries, the health authorities are now measuring health on the basis of the so-called quality-adjusted life year, where you price a year of human life and divide life quality with the cost of a treatment. This is, of course, the economization of life. God is dead, long live money. We're truly living in a cliché of the Middle Ages where money is a measuring stick of everything. There's no end to superstition, and the ruins are piling up everywhere. Things are falling apart. There's chaos, wars, and academics all over the place. The economic crisis has turned into a political crisis. Neoliberalism has suffered an ideological breakdown, and different fascist solutions are being tested out across the continent. The capability of the ruling classes to prevent any serious challenge to the existing order and to capitalism has the upper hand for now. The most important thing is to prevent the crisis from becoming a revolutionary upheaval, it seems. Art cannot, of course, solve anything, but does perhaps present itself as a kind of signpost insofar as art is never really itself, but always becoming different, always expanding, and in that sense, open for the new. I mean, that would be the second kind of like positive spin on the modernistic concept of art, that art is somehow a gesture of hospitality. The expanded artwork that art has from the very beginning been an attempt to try to test the limits of art. That would be like an aesthetic philosophical attempt to try to come up with a positive analysis or reading of art. So we have now two positive spins on modern or contemporary art. But there's a third one, because in the present conjuncture, a conjuncture characterized by crisis, the question of the avant-garde, of course, naturally returns. Beyond the system internal challenges and participatory engaging spectacles of 1990s art, like relational aesthetics, in which democracy and the market were rarely questioned, it's again becoming possible to envisage artistic experiments that keep the revolutionary perspective in view and are associated with a radical transformation of the world. We've already seen art play a role in the revolts in Tunisia and Egypt, for instance, and in the protest movement in Europe and the US, echoing historical moments in the past where artists joined forces with a revolutionary movement. In Tunis and in Cairo in 2011, we saw the return of a kind of dada in the form of a sneering art of provocation that ridiculed the church, the mosque, and the dictator, all the while self-critically investigating what the revolutionary process is, including the question of mental inertia, to which the Situationists devoted so much attention in the 1960s. And this has also been the case in the US, for instance. From the start, Occupy Wall Street has been characterized by a creative critical gesture, where the diversion of public space has been important. From the occupation of Sokoti Park, renamed Liberty Square, the erection of a Tahrir-inspired tent camp in the middle of the financial district of Manhattan, to the projection of Occupy slogans on the 32-floor Verizon building in Lower Manhattan. Occupy Wall Street has used post-situationist devices where urban space becomes the object of creative interventions that question the layout of the city and make visible alternative ways of organizing it beyond the constraints of a neoliberal city council, the political system, and its police. So this would be, in a certain sense, if we can divide these different ways of trying to be more affirmative towards the role or function of art, this would be the third one, the re-emergence of a kind of avant-garde gesture, which we could see both in the Arab revolts, but also in parts of the place occupation movement in Southern Europe and the US. Yeah. But of course, we have to contextualize these different attempts to put art to political use. So, however, the protests that have spread across the world are being met by a counter-revolutionary reaction that's doing everything it can to contain and cancel the resistance to the ruling order. This reaction takes on different forms. In the rich part of the world, it shows itself in the form of drastic cuts in welfare and culture, in countries like Great Britain and Holland, or the complete destruction of society, as in the case of Greece, or the rise of fascism, as in the case of Trump in the US. In Africa, in large parts of Africa, further exploitation is on the menu in places like Nigeria and Kenya. Protests are being criminalized in Benin, and in Zambia and South Africa, striking workers are being shot by the police in what can only be described as massacres. The picture is more or less the same in Southeast Asia, where strikers are protesting miserable working conditions and minimum wages in Bangladesh, India, and South Korea. Everywhere, local capitalism demonstrates its readiness to engage in warlike scenarios that attempt to prevent alternatives manifesting themselves. In all of these contexts, capital is the concentration of power in the hands of a small group in accordance with Marx's description in Das Kapital, capital. Global finance capital is desperately trying to prolong a process of expropriation and exploitation that has been going on since the middle of the 1970s. We must not harbor any illusions about the ruling powers' will to defend themselves and prevent the crisis from developing into something new. The faith of the auto-globalization movement, which was violently suppressed even before 9/11, speaks its own language, as does the repression of the Second Intifada in Palestine. With the state of emergency, bombing, torturing, and detaining became part of the ruling power's normal mode of operation. Today we are in a situation where police and military are ready to manage any kind of unrest or turmoil in accordance with the radically expanded powers of the anti-terror laws. Thus, it makes no sense to imagine that the revolution will not be met by a strong and varied deployment of forces. Of course it will. We can already see that in Greece, Spain, Egypt, South Africa, etc. So, where are we now? The revolts in North Africa and the Middle East and the Occupy movement, and later the Black Lives Matter movement, have made a real change in perspective possible. And a coherent resistance to 11 years of emergency with extreme inequality, wars, ecological destruction and exclusion is being established. Of course, the ruling order is doing everything to prevent this from actually happening. But the global collapse of the money economy has begun. This is the place from where we begin.
Now, maybe some questions, I don't know, too dense and well, I was preparing just one question to Mikkel. And I don't know if to give time for the audience to settle down and have some other ideas. Well, and having this image as in mind, and one idea that I was thinking of when I was hearing you is that from my experience, when in the past, when people were painting commissioned graffiti, they retained the spray paint and they used the spray paint on a non-commissioned way. So there's this relation between commissioned and non-commissioned things. And my question is, how do you see it? How do you see this connection, if it exists, if it can exist, between these roles of art that you described, right? If someone can do a commissioned work and at the same time could be more, and if this is healthy or it's not positive because it's mining somehow the decision of the author. This is my...
No, of course that's it's a huge question and kind of like a fundamental one. And of course, part of what I was trying to do is of course trying to account for the really complicated doubleness of art that that I mean the scenario you describe is in a certain sense lays out the contradictory character of art. That of course art as an autonomous phenomenon is on the one side could be described as a space or a place or a discourse where it's possible to behave in a different way. That would be kind of like the modernist idea of the artist somehow being equipped with a kind of freedom. Art somehow is a place where different kinds of praxis survive because they are being excluded from the rest of life. That would be one way of kind of like giving a really brief account of the coming into being of the kind of like modernist art. And that of course equips art with some kind of potential. That's the promise in a certain sense. Adorno, Marcuse, and kind of like all of the Frankfurt School boys, critical theory boys, often quoted the French novelist or author Stendhal. He said, of course, that art contains a promise of happiness, une promesse de bonheur. And of course, in a certain sense, art contains a promise of a better, different world, somehow making images of a better world, or the artist somehow being allowed to carry out acts that would be illegal elsewhere. So that's kind of like the positive spin on art. And of course, the other half of the analysis carried out by Adorno or Benjamin or Debord or whoever would be to look at that freedom or that potential in a broader context, where it of course becomes evident that the transgressive nature of art or the freedom of the artist is of course embedded in a much broader development, where it's precisely the artist that's allowed to behave irresponsibly. I mean, and that would, when I say that in a certain sense, you could make an argument in favor of art being the place where really important political discussions have been going on for the last 25 years. That would be kind of like the positive reading. Of course, the more skeptical reading would be, yes, but they of course only take place within the confines of the art institution. So the politicians are still behaving more and more racist, and of course everybody knows that parliamentary democracy is a sham, it's a spectacle, but nobody does anything about it. So there's still some kind of borderline between the art institution and what's outside. But that's of course that's the situation we're trapped in a sense, and the contradictions are. They're somehow found. I mean, they go back to the very foundation of modern art, but we are faced with these contradictions, and of course it's really very difficult to. You can of course try to run into the woods or make some kind of invisible committee commune, not having laptops or telephones, and just somehow exit present-day capitalist society. But I mean, but that kind of making oneself invisible is perhaps not a viable strategy. So we are kind of like working within and on these contradictions all the time, in a certain sense. And of course the problem with large parts of academia and contemporary art is somehow that this promise of art is way too quickly abandoned, in a certain sense. I mean, this will also be related to kind of like the institutionalization of art, the academization of art, where the first thing art academy students somehow learn is some kind of semi-ironic attitude. They know, of course, that art contains some kind of promise of a different world, but they also know that this has never happened. So whenever you present some kind of radical gesture, you'll always somehow put it in quotation marks, making it visible for the audience that, of course, I mean, I know that this is just a gesture somehow, and that would be, I mean, that's a huge problem, I think. But that's kind of like, that's the contradiction, of course, that we're somehow faced with and working on, and that's why it's all so much better to, even though it's completely ridiculous in many ways, to organize a seminar around the notion of revolution. Of course, it's still way better than many other non-totalistic grand concepts. Because there's no use in art unless it somehow tries to revisit this super huge ambition that it's supposed somehow to work on or work with. I don't know if.
Someone, I'm getting signs from down there. We are on time. Yeah, we need to break. Yeah. So. Mikkel, again, thank you. I think we could be staying here every day talking, and we will soon. Okay, thank you. Again, please. We have a short break, and after the break, we have the same topic, but from the artist perspective. We will have presentations from Kerry Richard and Igor Ponosov. So 10 minutes, 15 minutes, and we are back.